But Jessica suddenly felt drained. She didn't even finish a few spoonfuls of soup before falling asleep. Sarah moved her to the couch, covered her up, and pondered what to do next. The answer was obvious. Go find Aunt Ruby, who surely knew all the local news. At your place, the whole area is in an uproar looking for the poor little girl. Can you imagine? Her father is going out of his mind. Aunt Ruby, could you call whoever you need to, and I'll head back over? Go on, Sarah. She's been through a terrible ordeal spending that night in the woods. I'll call the station now. Sarah hadn't been home even half an hour before cars pulled up outside. She went to the door to ask them to stay quiet, but she didn't get the chance. A young man burst through in a whirlwind and, upon seeing Sarah, cried out, "Jessica, baby!" The little girl opened her eyes and was swept into her father's embrace, bursting into tears. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I was so scared. I'll never ever do that again." The man stroked her hair. "And you forgive me too, okay? We'll definitely go see the swans and listen for the cuckoo." Jessica pulled back. "Can Sarah come with us?" The man looked at Sarah, who felt self-conscious. "Of course, if Sarah wants to come." Sarah learned that Jared was some kind of internet genius who could work anywhere for a very high salary, designing games or something like that. Being computer illiterate herself, she didn't really follow his explanations. On their walk to the lake a week later, with Jessica running ahead, finally, the girl stopped. "Dad, geez, you talk to girls about that stuff? Honestly." Jared looked sheepish. "Sorry, Sarah, I don't interact with women much. I forgot what kind of conversations are appropriate." In that moment, all of Sarah's awkwardness dissipated. The rest of the time, they enthusiastically debated why swans have such long necks, what time the sun sets, and whether aliens experience love. Then Jared and Jessica walked Sarah home, where Jared had left his car. They were renting a house for the summer in the next town over. They lingered a long time, with Jessica not wanting to let Sarah go and Jared holding her hand, perhaps a bit too long, before they finally drove off. Sarah sighed and stepped towards her house. "Well, I did tell you, our little town is nice and in a good location. You'll find everything here, including a husband." Sarah turned to see Ruby smiling at her and laughed. "Oh, come on, Aunt Ruby. Jared's not a boyfriend prospect. We're just hanging out because of Jessica. You're imagining things." Sarah went inside while Ruby sighed and murmured, "No, Sarah, you can't run from your own happiness, no matter how hard you try." And a year later, Sarah and Jared came to town to ask Ruby to be the godmother of their newborn daughter, something little Jessica had expressly requested. How could Ruby refuse such a request from the young family? She was very afraid she would miss the moment he passed, but she needed to work and had to leave her husband alone for several hours. With her heart pounding, Catherine would return home and approach her husband's bed with even more trepidation. "I'm still alive," he would joke and smile. Her heart would clench so tightly she thought it might crush her. She didn't always find the strength to smile back. It was early morning. Kat had a day off. She resisted for a long time but finally decided to go to the cemetery. This would give her husband peace of mind. Kat turned right. The cemetery greeted her with silence and tranquility. If it weren't for the graves tightly pressed together, one could enjoy this peaceful atmosphere. Kat parked and got out of the car. She glanced at the door where people usually resolved issues with the caretaker or some other person. Kat knew little about these matters. An older yet lively and spry man emerged from a side building. "What can I help you with?" he asked gently. "I wanted to inquire about a plot. My husband's parents are buried here. His last wish is to be next to them after he dies. His days are numbered." It was his request. Kat pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "I understand, but you can only discuss this today after 12 o'clock or tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Mr. Black handles these matters." "Damn!" Kat crumpled the tear-soaked handkerchief. "All right, I understand. Thank you." Catherine trudged back to the car and suddenly saw her. Arrived to arrange a grave for her dying husband, she gave food to a beggar. Following her advice, she placed a camera in the hospital room and was stunned by what she saw in the recording. Katran was crying again, sitting in the basement. She had started the washing machine and let her tears flow. John was fading away. Her John, her beloved husband, could hardly get out of bed anymore. Cancer was viciously devouring the still young man. He had just turned 45. They had met at work. Katran had come to apply for a teaching position at an elementary school, and John had already been working as a swimming coach for several years. 6 months later, they were married. There was no happier couple. The only shadow over their happiness was the absence of children. Both wanted at least 2 kids, But time passed, and the dream remained a dream. Then Katrin found out she could never become a mother. She cried, unable to calm down and focus on anything else. John supported his wife as best he could, although he was also terribly upset. But then they tried to let go of the pain that tormented them both and continue living without children. John, darling, I have no right to keep you with me. You can find someone who can give you a child, maybe even more than one, Katie said. Do you not love me? Her husband said bitterly. How can you say that? I love you more than life itself. Then why this conversation? I don't need anyone else, even if she could give me 10 children. Do you understand? He took her hand. Johnny, I'm so sorry that I can't have children, she cried. Beloved, believe me, no one can replace you. This is our path, and we will walk it together. After all, we can think about adoption. Really? Katrin looked up at him with tearful eyes. I was afraid to start this conversation. I thought you would never agree. Don't cry, baby. I love you more than anything. John pulled her close and began to stroke her hair. Unfortunately, they never got around to adoption, and now John was dying. The doctor said there was no point in staying in the hospital. Now all he needed was the care and attention of loved ones, so that he could spend his last few months in love and peace. Why is fate so cruel to me? Katrin thought. I wasn't meant to be a mother, and now they're taking my beloved man from me, ruthlessly and cruelly. Despair filled her entire being. She could hardly bear to look at the almost skeletal JN. She tried to be strong, not to show how much it hurt to see death literally holding him by the hand. Katrin forced a smile and tried to talk about trivial things to cheer John up, to give him moments of joy, but it came out poorly, somehow insincerely. Now Katrin was sitting on the floor in the basement, crying over her entire life, her failed motherhood, her happy but short married life. But she couldn't sit for long. She had to pull herself together and go to John. He might need her help. Katrin stood up and went to the bathroom to compose herself. Her husband must not see tears on her face. Katie, John said quietly when she entered the bedroom. What is it, Johnny? Katrin approached the bed and sat next to him. Have you looked into the grave? He suddenly asked. What grave? You remember. I want to be buried next to my parents. I remember. Katrina swallowed a lump in her throat. And have you checked? No, John, please don't talk about this now. Don't bury yourself alive, Katie, baby. It's better to think about it in advance. It will be easier for you later. John pinched the bridge of his nose. His darkened face and greasy hair made him look like a zombie from a horror movie. His nose had become sharp, his cheeks hollow, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Only his eyes remained almost the same, deep and filled with kindness and tenderness for the whole world. John had always been like that, ever since he was a child. He strove to help everyone in need. It didn't matter if it was a pigeon with a broken wing, or the neighbor's girl scolded by her aunt for not doing her homework. John always found a dozen kind words for everyone, and tried his best to help. Katrina could no longer hold back her tears. I can't live without you. I don't want to live without you. My girl, don't cry, please don't. Maybe I did something wrong in this life, or perhaps this is just my lot of time on earth. You can live without me. You're strong and very beautiful. He took her hand in his thin, dry hand, so they sat until JN fell asleep. Suddenly, Kat felt as if her husband wasn't breathing. She placed 2 fingers on his neck. It was always easier for her to find his pulse in that area. She felt faint pulses. John was alive, just sleeping. Catherine got up from the bed and quietly left the room. How much time does he have left, she thought, sitting at the kitchen table and fidgeting with a towel lying next to the salt shaker. She was very afraid she would miss the moment he passed, but she needed to work and had to leave her husband alone for several hours. With her heart pounding, Catherine would return home and approach her husband's bed with even more trepidation. I'm still alive, he would joke and smile. Her heart would clench so tightly she thought it might crush her. She didn't always find the strength to smile back. It was early morning. Kat had a day off. She resisted for a long time, but finally decided to go to the cemetery. This would give her husband peace of mind. Kat turned right. The cemetery greeted her with silence and tranquility. If it weren't for the graves tightly pressed together, one could enjoy this peaceful atmosphere. Kat parked and got out of the car. She glanced at the door where people usually resolved issues with the caretaker or some other person. Kat knew little about these matters. An older yet lively and spry man emerged from a side building. What can I help you with? He asked gently. I wanted to inquire about a plot, My husband's parents are buried here. His last wish is to be next to them after he dies. His days are numbered. It was his request. Kat pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. I understand, but you can only discuss this today after 12 o'clock or tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Mr. Black handles these matters. Damn. Kat crumpled the tear-soaked handkerchief. All right, I understand. Thank you. Catherine trudged back to the car and suddenly saw her ran her hand through his lifeless hair, which had recently been so beautiful and soft. I want to tell you about a promise I made several years ago. Kat looked intently into her husband's eyes, and John told his wife a story that had happened about 10 years ago. John had a friend, Dean. They had been friends since childhood, always helping each other and constantly coming up with something interesting. The boys were on the same wavelength. That's what everyone who knew them said. Then his friend went abroad for work. There he married a beautiful girl named Mary. They had a baby girl, Molly. Dean came back with his family to visit his sister in their hometown. John had only exchanged a few words with his friend. He had promised to visit them, John and Kat, the next day, but he didn't come because Mary found her husband dead in the morning. A blood clot broke loose, was the doctor's verdict. At his friend's grave, John swore never to abandon Mary and her little daughter. John kept his promise. He helped them. First, he found an apartment and helped pay the rent. Mary didn't want to accept the help and didn't want Catherine to know about it. Everyone has their quirks, but John didn't stop helping. Sometimes he would go to a nearby town to bring groceries and toys for the girls. Several years passed like this. Then Mary and Molly moved away. From what John understood, she had found a man. She didn't leave an address and changed her phone number. John couldn't understand why she did that. She had always treated him with immense gratitude and respect, and then suddenly she disappeared. Maybe she didn't want to be a bother. Or perhaps it was painful for her to interact with someone who knew her husband so well and reminded her of him every minute. She saw him now. All that was left was to guess. Then John got sick. At first, he fought with all his might, but the cancer wasn't going to let go, digging its claws into his right kidney and spreading metastases throughout his body, offshoots of its malice and fear of losing its prey. At almost 1, John was defeated, lying in bed and fading away every day, every minute. At 45, he looked 70. Only his eyes sometimes still sparkled with childlike mischief, though even they were giving up, growing cloudier and losing their shine and spark of joy and hope. The spark of hope was also fading in Catherine's heart. Why was she losing the person most dear to her? How to live without him? Where to find the meaning of life? Her students, yes, Catherine loved her job, but they were someone else's children, not hers. All she could do was teach them to read, write, count, and much more. But then they would go home and discuss their day with their parents, watch TV, or go to a pizzeria, and she would return home where there was no, and never would be the sound of children's laughter. No one would ever call her mom or ask for a bedtime story. Life was empty, absolutely empty, like a discarded Pepsi can in the trash. John, why didn't you tell me about this earlier? We could have helped Mary and her daughter together, she asked. She asked me not to say anything, her husband replied wearily, closing his eyes. And I didn't want to burden you. I just promised Dean, promised at his grave, that I would never abandon his girls. He loved them so much. Tears streamed down the wrinkled cheeks of the man. Johnny, you're such a good person. People like you shouldn't get sick. They should be enjoying life and bringing joy to others. I lived a happy life, Kathy. I met you, my star, my angel. I'm grateful to the Lord for that. Kate took her husband's hand. He looked at her with eyes full of love, and his gaze froze. He no longer squeezed her hand. John, no, don't die! Kate screamed beside herself with despair and fear. Her husband wasn't breathing. His pulse, which Catherine had checked so often lately, had stopped. The woman ran her hand over his face to close his eyelids so she wouldn't see the lifeless gaze of her beloved, the best person on this planet, her true soulmate. No, he hadn't lied to her, he hadn't cheated. He had crushed his dream of having children for her sake. He loved her, just as Catherine still loved her husband, who had left this world. They never did decide to adopt a child, though. They didn't reject the idea, but then it became impossible after the funeral. Kat wandered aimlessly around the house. Everything reminded her of John. There was his favorite towel with a dolphin on it, and there were his favorite sneakers with bright green laces. Those sneakers would never again run along the park trail early in the morning, never again crunch on the gravel announcing John's return home. On the nightstand by the bed lay some papers. It was a draft of a will, an unfinished will that would never come into effect. "Mary Edward W. Molly Edwards," muttered the woman, her eyes skimming over the sheet of paper filled with John's painfully familiar handwriting. But Mary was dead. John had told her that. Where was her daughter now? For some reason, Catherine remembered the skinny girl she had recently met at the cemetery. What if Mary's daughter was also living in poor conditions and about to be sent to an orphanage? No, she couldn't let that happen. John had promised never to abandon his friend's family, but John was gone now. So only Kat could help the poor girl. "David, hi, it's Kat. I was a good friend of the late John." "Hi, Katie. How are you?" "David, please tell me, what do you know about Mary and Molly Edwards?" "Let me come over and we can talk." "Okay, sure. Is today after 5 convenient for you?" "Yes, I'm free all day." They said their goodbyes. Catherine barely made it through the last day before summer vacation. After stopping by the store, she headed home. David was due to arrive soon. They sat in the living room drinking freshly brewed coffee. When Mary died, the girl was taken in by Dean's sister Gina. They live nearby. She has 2 daughters and her husband went missing 2 years ago. Kat had heard something similar before, but she wasn't surprised. She hadn't slept well for several nights, and everything in her head was mixed up and confused. "David, I'm ready to finish what John started. I mean the will." "Katie, you're an amazing person. Anyone else in your place would have said it's not their business and wouldn't change their life for some orphan." "Oh, come on, David. It's just a humane thing to do. I can imagine how she must feel. I recently met a poor girl about 11 at the cemetery. How I wish no child on earth would ever be without parents." Kat sighed and sipped some coffee from a small white cup. "Yes, it's tough for orphans. I know from experience." David placed his cup on the saucer. "If you want, we can build a genus together and find out everything we can to process the apartment for the girl right now. Anyway, it's only been a short time since John's death." "Yes, you're right," the woman pondered. "Let's go visit them and see if they need any help." They agreed to go to Gina's the next morning. Unfortunately, David didn't have her phone number, so they decided to just go and hope for the best. "David, where are we going?" "To the cemetery," Kat asked, staring out the window. "Yeah, then further. You know those old brown houses? That's where Dean's sister lives. Quite a place, really." Catherine shivered. She had already been here with that girl. What was her name? Molly. "Yes," she said her name was Molly, and I thought of some Holly. My memory is terrible. It's like I'm not 38 but 9. Here is the corrected version of the text. "Don't worry. Once you recover from the stress, everything will get better." "How can I recover from it, David?" "How? It's so hard without John." "I understand, Katie, but you'll have to live without him. You know you need to find new meaning in life. Get a dog. Start with that." "Oh, come on, David. A dog? That's such a responsibility." "We're here." He parked the car and turned off the engine. "Shall we go?" "Yes, let's go." Kat unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. Gina turned out to be a very pleasant woman with chestnut hair. She was poorly dressed, but her worn-out dress was clean and ironed. "David," began David, "we came to ask about Molly." "Who are you?" she asked. "Why, I'm a friend of John Blair, and this is his wife, Catherine. We wanted to talk to you about the girl John decided to leave his apartment to, but unfortunately, he passed away before he could finalize it." "I want to complete this," Kat interjected. "Molly went missing yesterday afternoon," she continued. "She left and didn't come back home. Maybe she's at a friend's house?" Catherine asked, concerned. "No, she left a note." Gina handed over a sheet torn from a school notebook. "Dear Aunt Gina, I love you very much. Thank you for taking care of me. I know things are very hard for you, but I don't want to go to an orphanage. I'm leaving. Don't look for me. I would rather die than live in that horrible place. In heaven, I will meet Mom and Dad, and we will be fine. Molly." "My God, what a nightmare!" Kat ran her fingers through her hair and clenched them into a fist. "We need to find her. She couldn't have gone far, she couldn't have walked far, but she could have taken a ride," David said thoughtfully. "Have you contacted the police?" "Yes, this morning." Gina wiped her tears. "But they say we need to wait. The child will definitely come back." "But what if something has already happened to her? God, why does she think I'm going to send her to an orphanage? I would never do that. She's my niece." Gina covered her face with her hands. "All right, we need to go," David said resolutely. "Where does the girl like to spend time?" "I don't know. She would just go for walks and then come back," Gina muttered in confusion. "I know." Kat jumped up from the chair she was sitting on. She loves to be at the cemetery. The cemetery? David and Gina exclaimed in unison. Yes, that's where I met her. She said she likes the quiet. She can think and dream there. Let's go there immediately. Kat wandered between the graves. All she could hear were the birds singing and the lazy flies buzzing. The cemetery was small. You could walk through it in an hour. Molly! Kat shouted, "Sweetheart, answer me. No one is going to send you to an orphanage, Molly." But the only response was silence. A squirrel scampered up the trunk of an old tree, nimbly moving its paws. In the far corner of the cemetery, where there were still not many graves, Kat stopped and looked around. "Molly, dear, answer me," Kat said softly, and sat down on the grass. She hugged her knees and cried, burying her face in them. She hadn't felt such despair since she buried her husband. He wanted so much to help Mary and her daughter. He wanted to. She could not betray John. She must find Molly, no matter what. Suddenly, Kat felt someone touch her shoulder. She flinched and looked up. Molly stood before her, her hair disheveled, her dress dirty and crumpled. "Molly!" Kat didn't have the strength to get up. "Hi, you came for me. I heard you calling me. I thought I was dreaming. I don't want to go to an orphanage, my Molly sweetheart. No one is going to send you to an orphanage. It's true. Your aunt told me that today. You must have misunderstood." "No, it's not true," she said. "No one can shelter the girl, only me, but..."